So I woke up early today, Saturday morning. It's a Saturday morning after our recent Friday get-together. Not 24 hours from now. The group got together. This is our series on Seminar 20. And let me tell you, man, this was our third get-together. I am wowed by this group. I'm wowed by what has become this Lectures on Lacan community. If you want to find a place where conceptual rigor meets clinical expertise, meets hilarity, meets seriousness, if you want to see a terrific intellectual community, you got to come check this out. And look, I don't want money to be the issue, like it's a donation-based series anyway, but if you just have an internet connection and $0, email me. You got to come to at least one of these sessions and check out these folks. We got people from all over the world reading Lacan in different languages, not just French and not just English, man. Spanish Lacan is the hot Lacan these days. The amount of brain power, kindness, warmth, and openness that emerges in these discussions never ceases to amaze me. So I'm still reeling from this. I'm still feeling it here on Saturday morning, not 24 hours since our last get-together. And I woke up today eager to sit down and tap record, not just to tell you all this, but to start getting us through one of these middle chapters, Chapter 6 of Seminar 20. Last discussion clarified some of this stuff for me. Let me see if I can tell you how it breaks down. Chapter 6 of Seminar 20 begins with Lacan recalling that other satisfaction with which he began his last lesson. This other satisfaction, he tells us, is the satisfaction of speech, which means it answers to phallic jouissance. It's on page 64. You can check it out. In other words, on my reading, this other satisfaction is not that other enjoyment. The other satisfaction of the one, of oneness, of completion, of wholeness, bliss, and all those universals we've been discussing. This is the other satisfaction that phallic enjoyment promises but ultimately fails to deliver. And it is not the other enjoyment that Lacan's been talking about in Seminar 20. Another enjoyment which is symbolized by the body of the other sex, namely that of the feminine subject. Sum it up, you got it. Phallic enjoyment wagers on the jouissance of the one. Feminine enjoyment, however, is rooted in that of the other. Put a bit more archly, and you know me, I'm always down to put things a bit more archly. The phallus marks the fantasy of the one, while the feminine marks the facticity of a certain other. An emphasis here on the word certain. This probably is not the big O other that you think it is, seeing how this is rendered in the English translation. Now, this fantasy of the one, we've talked a lot about it, and Lacan seems tempted to continue this line of inquiry in Chapter 6 of Seminar 20. Again, it's the fusional oneness of narcissistic love that our boy targets. And again, just as we've been discussing it in this series, so I think we can leave it at that. However, if you are still hot on this topic, check out pages 66 to 67 of Seminar 20. It's all right there for you. More interesting to Lacan, at this point, it seems to me, is the fact of that other and its relationship with what appears of the other sex, as he puts it on page 69. Note that characterization. The question here is the facticity of the other and its relationship to what appears of the other sex. And by this he means what appears of that other sex in the phallic field. So what exactly appears of feminine enjoyment in the field of phallic enjoyment? Well, I think it's safe to say at this point that some, but not all, of her enjoyment shows up there. Yes, okay, but how? Some but not all of her jouissance is governed by the phallic function, and it shows up in the phallic field. Yes, okay, but in what way? To start, let's just round out the logic here regarding this some. Why does some but not all of her jouissance show up in the phallic field? And what is this some in question? This some but not all of her enjoyment that shows up in the phallic field is only a part of her enjoyment. I think we can safely say that. Because this some is only a part, we can say that in the field of phallic enjoyment, feminine enjoyment is not whole. It's another way to access the not all. In the phallic field, she is not all. It's there, her enjoyment, to be sure, but only in part, for better and for worse. So also, when it comes to the feminized bodies that appear there. And here we get our first great passage. It's on page 72 to 73 in our English translation. Check it out. When any speaking being whatsoever situates itself under the banner women, it is on the basis of the following, that it grounds itself as being not whole in situating itself in the phallic function. That is what defines what? Woman, precisely, except that woman with a capital W can only be written with a bar through it. There's no such thing as woman, woman with a capital W, indicating the universal. There's no such thing as woman with a capital W because, in her essence, I've already risked using the term, so why should I think twice about using it again? She is not whole. Now, the first two moves in this passage, it seems to me, are ones that we've already discussed at length, but still worth noting here. First, this emphasis on any speaking being whatsoever situating themselves in the position of the feminine. Notice, again, it's about how you enjoy, not what's behind your swimsuit. Men can enjoy under the banner of women. Whether they're straight, gay, bi, trans, cisgendered, it doesn't matter. Lacan emphasizes this again on page 76. I love that he's increasingly bringing out this aspect. He first starts mentioning this capacity for male-sexed bodies to occupy the feminine position in Seminar 19 or worse. Here in Seminar 20, he keeps hitting on this point. I think it's a really important one. Notice how clear he is about this on page 76. One is not obliged, when one is male, to situate oneself on the side of the masculine function, which reads, all of their enjoyment is governed by the phallic function. One can also situate oneself on the side of the not whole. There are men who are just as good as women, it happens, and who also feel just fine about it. Despite, I won't say their phallus, despite what encumbers them that goes by that name, they get the idea or sense that there must be a jouissance that is beyond, here beyond the phallic function. Now check this out. Those are the ones we call mystics. And this gives us a clue, some orientation as far as where we're headed with this chapter as we edge toward the end. Face it, this is coming up on the end of Seminar 20. There's more of this book behind us than there is ahead of us at this point. And here we start edging toward the mystics. Men can be mystics. Women can be mystics. Mystics, however, are all feminine. We'll come to that as we come to it. Here I just want to emphasize this familiar point about any speaking being whatsoever being able to occupy the feminine position. It is not about sexed identity. It's about how you enjoy. Let me be clear about this, at the risk of saying way more than you want to hear at this point. Femininity is a mode of enjoyment. It is not a biological trait. It's about positionality, not anatomy. Men and women alike can fill this post. I hope we're clear on this. The second riff in that opening passage we considered in this lecture is also a familiar one. I believe it's straight from the opening pages of Seminar 20, in fact, pages we've already studied carefully. Again, the theme here, or at least the frame, is spatial. Notice this. It's about how feminized bodies and their attendant enjoyments are situated or located in the field of phallic jouissance. And I don't think there's anything new here. Lacan has been thinking this way since about page 7 in the English translation that we're reading here. If you want to recall this key passage for a moment with me, check it out. It's on page 7. It's just a quick riff, but it captures the spatial metaphoricity that Lacan's working with here when he's trying to define what appears of feminine enjoyment in the phallic field. It's really more about where and how this appears. Analytic experience, he says, attests precisely to the fact that everything revolves around phallic jouissance, and that woman is defined by a position that I have indicated as not whole, with respect to phallic jouissance. And then if you check out Bruce's translator's note that points us to the bottom of the page, we're talking about not whole in the place of phallic jouissance. And here in the passage that we read, about 60 pages later in Seminar 20, Lacan is back at it again, reminding us that it's a spatial dilemma, a spatial game that's being played here. Terrific stuff, but again, I don't think there's anything new here. It's not until the third move in this passage on page 72 that we get something new, or at least less familiar from Lacan. Woman can only be written with a bar through it. That's the line on page 72 that marks this third and advanced move. Again, note Bruce's translator's footnote to this. We're on page 72, and it's definitely worth a look here. And again, it's a footnote numbered 29. He says that in the French, Lacan says that we must bar the article la in la femme, which, as he tells us in the next sentence, is the definite article that designates the universal. In English, the definite article the sometimes functions in that way, as in the good, the just, and so on. Notice, we're talking about universals here. Woman for Lacan is one more universal. But what Lacan is saying we need to mark out is the la in front of femme, the in front of woman. In the case of woman, however, Bruce continues, the woman seems to imply a specific woman, like the woman of one's dreams or the woman downstairs, whereas Lacan is aiming here instead at a universal, like womanliness or the essence of woman. So that's what's being barred here, is an essence of woman, a standard of womanliness, a universal set known as woman, all women, that kind of business. Lacan is striking that out as he's making this move. And this strikes me as something interesting and something rather new. And note this repeated emphasis on that word that we've been considering, universal. The theme here is of a universal that cannot and does not exist. And we know what Lacan means by using this term universal from the Latin unus plus vertere, to turn into one. The three-part argument that I think is worth noting here is really one that at this point is just review. Phallic enjoyment, as we've seen, is goaded by universals of every sort, religious, moral, philosophical, you name it. This is what Lacan is doing with universals in Seminar 20. He's noting that phallic enjoyment is always goaded by these universals, which are non-existent. They're religious, they're moral, they're philosophical, you name it. And again, when I say non-existent, I mean that justice is not going to walk up your driveway and knock on your door. It's not out there in the world as an existent entity or event. You can approximate it. You can be more or less just in your everyday life. Your courts can be more or less just. But there is no such thing as justice. That's why she's always represented outside the courthouse with an illustrious statue. The universals that goad phallic enjoyment, they promise a certain kind of satisfaction, the same satisfaction with which Lacan began this chapter. It's the satisfaction of oneness, of wholeness, of completion, of consistency, and the like. Don't get this twisted. The satisfaction in question is that of the one, and this is the one of which phallic enjoyment falls short. And that's just it. Phallic enjoyment always comes up short relative to this satisfaction, letting us down, failing to deliver, and so on. That's the dilemma of the universal as Lacan sees it. But note the contrast, not in the field of phallic enjoyment, but when it comes to the feminine. In contrast, feminine enjoyment does not stake satisfaction on universals, you've heard me say. Universals which are no such thing, you've heard me say. And thus, as you've also heard me say, feminine enjoyment has nothing against which to come up short. Foremost among these non-existent universals Lacan is here adding is that of the woman, woman with a capital W, womanliness, and so forth. Here's how he's thinking through this. In the field of phallic enjoyment, which is the only field we know, women are not whole. Their enjoyment is not all there in the phallic field. And for these reasons, there can be no closed, complete, universal set known as woman with a capital W. Man? Yes, because all masculine enjoyment is fully encompassed by the phallic function. All masculine enjoyment is governed by the phallus. But woman? No, not all feminine enjoyment is governed by the phallic function. And so woman with a capital W falls apart. It doesn't work here. What then does the word woman signify? What do we mean by la femme, the woman? In truth, it doesn't signify a damn thing. Turn the page, wind up at 73 with me, and you'll start to see why. I already spoke of man and, quote, woman. That woman is a signifier. With it, I symbolize the signifier whose place it is indispensable to mark. That place cannot be left empty. Woman is a signifier, the crucial property of which is that it is the only one that cannot signify anything. And this is simply because it grounds woman's status in the fact that she is not whole. That means we can't talk about woman. A woman can but be excluded by the nature of things, which is the nature of words. And don't ever forget that. For Lacan, the nature of things is the nature of words, and it always excludes woman. What then, because we're trying to be good Lacanians here, is the not anything signified by la femme, the woman, woman with a capital W, womanliness, and all of them barred? I think this not anything signified here is twofold. First, it's that of an impossibility, which relative to the phallic function only ever exists, insisting there but only from without as an exclusion. Here again is that impossible jouissance we've been discussing. That jouissance which does not and cannot appear in the phallic field, and for this reason does not and cannot fail to remain itself relative to that field. Fucking impossible. But check it out. This not anything signified by slashed out signifier woman, it's also the not whole. That is also what it signifies when it signifies not a single thing. It signifies the not whole that this impossible jouissance makes of her. So yes, it points to the fact that not all of her enjoyment is phallic, that there is a part of her enjoyment that exceeds the phallic function and thus can't show up there relative to the phallic function that is impossible. However, what this impossibility makes of the feminine subject is a permanent state of not wholeness. That is also what woman slashed out designates when it designates not anything at all. It designates the not whole that impossible jouissance makes of the feminine subject. That's a really key point here. We'll come back to it in a minute. For now, though, just recall what we know about impossible enjoyment, because it's a great place for us to start. And in order to do that, you also have to note its necessary correlate, which we've been discussing. So let's see what we have here. Phallic enjoyment is necessary enjoyment. It's the kind of enjoyment necessitated by language use. This is what we've set up so far. For us speaking beings, it must be, and it must fail. Feminine enjoyment, beyond the phallic function, however, is impossible enjoyment, we've established. A kind of enjoyment barred by language use. For speaking beings like ourselves, feminine enjoyment beyond the phallic function cannot be and cannot fail. Now, I hope at this point that these statements on failure are a little more clear than they were when we first started kicking them around. It really stacks up to a fairly straightforward argument. Phallic enjoyment always fails to live up to universals it is not. Period. Feminine enjoyment, the part that is beyond the phallic function, however, it never fails to let go of universals that it is not. Note that key distinction. Phallic enjoyment fails to live up to the same universals that feminine enjoyment never fails to let go of. The dilemma of phallic enjoyment is that it's constantly trying to live up to universals. And the great benefit of feminine enjoyment is that you let go of all that shit. You can let go of the universals. So the question of failure or success really depends here on whether you're trying to live up or you have the courage to let go. Because phallic enjoyment fails to live up to universals that it is not, it carries with it a certain dissatisfaction. And at some level, that's really what this is about. Phallic enjoyment is dissatisfying because it always positions us as failing to live up to some universal that is not, that we're not, that's never going to be. In the field of phallic enjoyment, we're routinely let down as a result, left wanting, and left feeling inadequate. Not so in the mode of enjoyment Lacan calls feminine. Because feminine enjoyment beyond the phallic function never fails to let go of universals that it ain't, it allows for a certain contentment. And I think this is what Lacan means when he says, women content themselves. Any woman contents herself being not whole with the jouissance in question. By which, of course, he means the part of her enjoyment that can only be experienced as impossible. And notice, I said experienced, not known. In the final paragraphs of chapter 6, it all comes down to this. And Lacan keeps hammering on this point around experiences that are had but unknown and then subsequently sung about. To find it, you'll need to flip the page again, this time to 74 and 75. I'll just read a quick couple of snippets here for you. There is a jouissance that is hers, about which she herself perhaps knows nothing, if not that she experiences it. That much she knows. Next passage. The plausibility of what I am claiming here, namely, that woman knows nothing of this jouissance, is underscored by the fact that in all the time people have been begging them on their hands and knees. I spoke last time about women psychoanalysts, to try to tell us not a word. We've never been able to get anything out of them. For a while now, Lacan's been asking and attempting to answer a simple question of what. What is this mode of feminine enjoyment beyond the phallic function about which feminine subjects know nothing except that they experience it? For a while now, Lacan's just been trying to answer that question. What is that shit? What is the mode of enjoyment that feminine subjects know nothing about except that they experience it? This mode of enjoyment beyond the phallic function. Here, at the end of chapter 6, I think he's edging towards a different question. I think we know the answer to the question of what. He is now beginning to shift to the question of how. How do feminine subjects experience this unknown and profoundly unknowable mode of enjoyment? And how, if at all, can they speak about this experience? Notice that shift. We're no longer just asking what feminine enjoyment beyond the phallic function is. You know what it is. It's impossible. We're now talking about how. How can that impossibility be experienced? And how, if ever, can it be spoken? Can it be said? Can someone say that they experienced it, to clarify things? So what we have here, I'd suggest, is we have one what and two hows, for a total of 3 questions. What is feminine enjoyment beyond the phallic function? That's our first question. You just heard me say it. It's impossible enjoyment. Enjoyment so impossible that it's not just unknown, but also fundamentally unknowable. Here you get Lacan's formula of feminine sexuation that reads, not all of her enjoyment is governed by the phallic function. That formula captures, in a nutshell, what we just said here. Feminine enjoyment beyond the phallic function is impossible enjoyment. It's enjoyment that is so impossible, as though there could be degrees, that it's not just unknown, but also fundamentally unknowable. Second of our 3 questions is the first of the how questions. How do feminine subjects experience that impossible shit? As we're going to see, in their bones. The third question is also a how question. Okay, they experience it in their bones, McCormick. You better back that up. How, if ever, do feminine subjects speak about this impossible experience that they have in their bones? How, if ever, do feminine subjects speak about impossible jouissance? What I would suggest, to get us started, is that they do so with no small amount of enjoyment. Again, as we're about to see. I think this is what's at stake in the turn toward the mystics at the end of chapter 6. And note this menagerie: Hadwich Danvers, St. John of the Cross, St. Teresa, even the author of a famous volume known as Écrit, one Jacques Lacan himself, if you don't mind. Yeah, he includes himself in this list of mystics. Jacques Lacan, the great feminine subject. Think about that for a minute, especially in light of what came up in yesterday's discussion, one among many very interesting topics, around what he's saying at this point about those lady psychoanalysts. You just heard him mention it in this passage. He also mentions it in the previous lesson. He even refers to that previous lesson in the passage that we just read, about lady psychoanalysts not telling us a damn thing about that impossible enjoyment, despite us being on our hands and knees begging them. Interesting, Lacan positions himself in this list of mystics. And again, it's a mix, baby. You got males and females, penises and vulvas in this list of mystics at the end of chapter 6. Remember, sexuation is about how one enjoys, not what or who one enjoys, and certainly not what is underneath your swimsuit. Now, this doesn't mean that the body isn't involved. Quite the contrary. Mystical experience and mystical testimony to that experience both involve the speaking body. And that's an important part. It doesn't matter what body you have. It matters that you have one at this point. The body of the mystic is the body that enjoys saying they experience an other enjoyment. An other enjoyment they experience but know nothing about. And this cleaves pretty close to Lacan's thought at this point. We have two types of enjoyment. An impossible enjoyment, and then the enjoyment that comes with saying we experience impossible enjoyment. The key phrase comes on page 76. Lacan asks, what does she enjoy, with reference to these feminized mystics? It is clear that the essential testimony of mysticism, he continues, is to precisely say this, that they experience it but know nothing about it. And note, this is a slightly more literal translation from the French than the one that Bruce gives us. But you can see how Bruce renders this on page 76. You can go back to the French, as I just did, and cook up a different translation of your own, perhaps. But I think this one cleaves pretty closely. What does she enjoy? What does she get off on here? It's clear that the essential testimony is to precisely say this, that they experience it but know nothing about it. They enjoy saying they experience an enjoyment beyond the phallic function. What we're looking at here, again, I believe, is two enjoyments, both feminine, both at stake in the embodied testimonies of the mystics, emphasis on them being embodied testimonies. The first enjoyment, as you've heard me say, is an enjoyment experienced but unknown and wildly unknowable because that shit's impossible, as we've discussed. And second, an enjoyment that comes with saying as much, with testifying to this mystical experience. The key word here is testimony. It's not just a saying of any old stripe here. We're talking about testimony that is enjoyed. We enjoy testifying to the experience of an enjoyment beyond the phallic function. That's two modes of enjoyment, my friends. Notice how they play out. In the discourse of the mystic, if we can call it that, we see and hear an embodied and enjoyed act of saying, encore, spelled with a space between the N and the C, as we've been learning, which is exactly what testimony means. Run the etymology on testimony and you'll see, I'll give you a clue. Testimony comes from the same root that gives us testicles. In the discourse of the mystic, we see an embodied and enjoyed testimonial act that speaks to an other mode of enjoyment. An other mode of enjoyment that the mystic knows they've experienced, but about which they have no conscious knowledge. And what do I mean by conscious knowledge here? I mean the kind of knowledge mediated through language. Knowledge which in turn lends itself to being spoken. In other words, said. And again, Encore. Here spelled without a space between the N and the C. With this final addition, conscious knowledge, as you heard me describe it, I think we have enough, just enough, to show how all of this is starting to hang together. At the risk of putting it a bit too starkly, a bit too quickly, I'd say we have 3 types of knowledge to consider, and with each a certain mode of enjoyment. 3 types of knowledge and 3 attendant modes of enjoyment. Let's start with the knowledge side of things. And as always, let's start with what is most familiar to us, which I would wager here is conscious knowledge. What do I mean by conscious knowledge? It's knowledge mediated through language. It's that D-mention, spelled D-I-T mention, that Lacan's been toying with, where what is said, the D, the D-I-T, takes priority. And notice this, what is said takes priority. What do I mean by that? I mean that signifieds in this dimension known as conscious knowledge take precedent over signifiers. And signifiers take precedent over speaking bodies. That is the hierarchy that we know as conscious knowledge. Signifieds over signifiers over speaking bodies. We established much of this in our last series on Le Tour D, but I think it still is resonant here. The dimension where what is said takes priority, known as conscious knowledge, is one in which signifieds trump signifiers trump bodies. Thankfully, this is not all we know. Conscious knowledge isn't the only field of knowledge accessible to us. There is also this thing, this place, this other space known as unconscious knowledge, which is the second on our list of 3. So shifting now from conscious knowledge to unconscious knowledge. We've talked a lot about it in previous series. Lacan hasn't spent a lot of time speaking about it since the mid-1950s when he was really laser focused on this shit. In a nutshell, Lacan's theory of unconscious knowledge is premised on his, at this point in the 1970s, a classic Lacanian riff against Descartes. And it goes something like this. It's from Écrit around, it's in the instance of the letter essay. I am thinking where I am not. Therefore, I am where I'm not thinking. So he's fucking with the Cartesian maxim. I think, therefore I am. And what Lacan comes up with to start moving us towards a robust understanding of the unconscious is not I think, therefore I am, but this. I am thinking where I am not. I am thinking where I, as a conscious, knowing, egoic subject, am not. Therefore, I am, as something else entirely, where I am not thinking as a conscious, egoic subject. Here, though, in Seminar 20, it's less about thinking and more about knowledge. That's what concerns us here. Beyond the known knowledge of the conscious ego, we have the unknown knowledge of an unconscious subject. So if you're looking for a way to kind of chunk these things out that's clear, coherent, and accessible, I would run it like this. The conscious ego occupies a place of known knowledge, knowledge that is known. But the unconscious subject finds itself in a field of unknown knowledge. So you have known knowledge and unknown knowledge, the first of which corresponds to consciousness and the other to the unconscious. Within this field of unknown because unconscious knowledge, there are two types of unconscious knowledge: that which is knowable and that which is unknowable. So be a good Aristotelian and start mapping this stuff out. Conscious knowledge on one hand, unconscious knowledge on the other, and then you can take unconscious knowledge and divide it into two subsets, two subcategories. There are parts of unconscious knowledge that can be known. They are unknown at present, but they can be known. They can become known. They are knowable. However, there are parts of unconscious knowledge that cannot be known, that remain ever recalcitrant to the field of knowledge, and thus we might call them unknowable. Notice these two moves. Unconscious knowledge that can be known is that which can be deciphered and captured in language, if only painstakingly, by way of psychoanalytic experience in particular. This is what the hystericization of the analysand is all about. It's about taking unknown knowledge in the field of the unconscious and capturing it in language, in basically a deciphered code, where now it can enter the field of known knowledge. That's what you see when you look at the discourse of the hysteric as it applies to clinical experience. You see a barred subject interrogating their symptomatic statements, that S1, and producing, via dialectization, connections to unconscious truths that were previously unknown. There's that S2. Unconscious truths, now deciphered and captured in knowledge, that feed right back into that barred subject. And be very careful about what's happening here. Don't get this twisted. Those deciphered aspects of unknown, unconscious knowledge that can be known through this process of hystericization, these are objects for surplus enjoyment. That's why they're positioned in the lower right-hand quadrant of the hysteric's discourse. I've said this before, but I think it's worth noting again, because this is in part, in Lacan's view, where analysis goes astray. You wind up with a hystericized analysand that never stops running that circuit from barred subject to S1 to S2 to barred subject. It's a circuit, though, of surplus enjoyment, because they are getting off on the commodifications of their unconscious truth that are emerging in the forms of these understandings and insights into why they have been doing what they've been doing for all this time. And the dilemma, I think, for Lacan, in part, as you edge toward the end of analysis, is that you wind up with a hystericized analysand who doesn't give up on that enterprise. They keep thinking that they can run that circuit and eventually capture the full extent of their unconscious knowledge in language, and thus render it conscious knowledge. That's one of the wagers that the analysand brings to this process, that if I just keep pushing and just keep analyzing my symptoms, eventually I won't have an unconscious. And again, this is one of the basic confusions around what psychoanalysis as a clinical enterprise is all about. A lot of people look at it and think it's about know thyself. It is not about know thyself. It is about finding the outer limits of that enterprise, beyond which you can no longer know thyself. And that, indeed, is precisely what you need to know about yourself, and precisely what you learn or find out about yourself in a good psychoanalysis, according to Lacan. There comes an end to this dialectization, this constant deciphering of symptoms to reveal their unconscious truths. You eventually run up against a limit. Colette Soler is very good on this. She talks about eventually just running out of steam on this process. The analysand eventually stops deriving surplus enjoyment from this exercise in capturing their unconscious knowledge in linguistic form, namely as conscious knowledge. But that's what this is fundamentally about here. Knowable unconscious knowledge is the part of the unconscious that lends itself to this process. But the point in all of this is don't fucking forget that there's this other part of the unconscious that is unknowable, that doesn't lend itself to this process. And that is the point where we're headed. Not all unconscious knowledge is knowable. Most of it, in fact, I would wager, is unknowable and fiercely resists capture by the signifying articulations of those who possess it, hystericized or not. This, in my view, is the type of unconscious knowledge that concerns us here. The unknowable part of this unknown knowledge that we call the unconscious. That's what we're edging towards in Chapter 6 of Seminar 20. The type of unconscious knowledge so unknowable that relative to conscious knowledge, it remains, wait for it, impossible, exactly as we've been discussing it. Now, you might say, we've talked a lot about truth. Can we frame this in terms of what Lacan at this point is doing with truth? Yes, but only to a certain extent, because truth is not the end of the line, as we've learned. Let's give it a run, though, just for further clarification. Here, what we would say, in terms of truth, is we are not talking about the part of unconscious truth that can be said, albeit only as nonsense in the form of symptomatic statements. Instead, we're talking about the part of truth, unconscious truth, that cannot be said and thus remains absent from any and all signifying articulations, symptomatic or not, and thus absent from conscious knowledge. So remember how we broke this down in our series on Lettourdi. The symptom has a sense to it, and that is one of nonsense. The unconscious also has a sense to it, and that is a sense of absence. And you'll note this is where Alain Badiou and I disagree, on where absence belongs relative to the analytic discourse. He wants to assign it to the real, and I'm saying no, that's not actually what Lacan says. What Lacan is up to here is assigning absence to the unconscious, which is not the real. At this point in Lacan's thought, the unconscious is not yet the real. The unconscious is a field of truth, but the truth is not the real. The truth, you've heard me say, building straight out of Lettourdi, is the real's little sister. The real is the bossy older sister of truth, a sensei. If you want to know the sense of the real, it's that of a sensei, an elder teacher that's been around for quite a bit longer, the one that bosses truth around. So truth is only going to get us so far toward the end game here, which for Lacan at this point is the real. We are still, though, just navigating this field of truth, here unconscious truth, and we're talking about its two sides, the part that can be said and thus known, the part that can't be said and thus cannot be known. And what I'm saying is that we're shifting with unconscious knowledge here away from the part that can be known through endless hystericization and the part that cannot be known and marks a barrier or a limit to that process. Again, the key word here to capture this aspect of the unconscious is impossible. I didn't come here to just talk to you about that. There's a third bit of knowledge that is the one we're really trying to carve out here. Everything you've heard from me up to this point on knowledge is shit you already know. You probably heard it from me. You probably heard it from 100 other people. What we're trying to get at is a third form of knowledge that occurs between conscious and unconscious knowledge. A third type of knowing, and it's the third on our list, in trying to understand what these mystics are up to. Jacques Lacan himself included, he says. Here's how I would stack it up. Between conscious knowledge and its unconscious correlate, and irreducible to either, is what I would call corporal knowledge. It's the type of knowledge that is rooted in affective bodily experience. And what I'm telling you is that it is not conscious knowledge, and it is also not unconscious knowledge. Corporal knowledge is something different and irreducible to either conscious or unconscious knowledge. It's a wager. I'm sure we'll talk about it at our next Friday get-together. I hope you can make it. This shit is legit. You got to get in on this stuff. Even if you just want to show up and listen to these badasses unfurl, think, joke, and enjoy. If you want to see the real joy that can be experienced in Lacanian culture, in Lacanian theory and technique at the level of a discussion, just holler at me. You got to at least sit in on one of these things. The community is legit. The community is supportive. And these motherfuckers are wicked smart. My mind is blown at every single one of these sessions. Like I said, I was inspired to sit down and take these notes and deliver this lecture this morning after working with these folks. I guarantee this is going to be something that's going to come up at our next get-together. Because what I'm telling you is that there's a third type of knowledge that is irreducible to conscious or unconscious knowledge. And I'm calling it corporal knowledge. And I think there's support for this in what Lacan is doing at this point in his thought. Indeed, when Lacan says experience in the passages we read toward the end of chapter 6, the experience in question, and I'm thinking about his use of that word on 76, the experience in question is sensory experience. When he says experience on page 76, the French gives us an emphasis on sensation. This is sensory experience. It's from the French éprouver, meaning feeling, as in sensation. At issue here, it seems to me, is a kind of knowledge that we often describe as bone deep. This is what I meant earlier. How does she experience enjoyment beyond the phallic function? I told you she experienced it in her bones. That is also a certain type of knowledge. You might call it somatic knowledge. This came up yesterday as well, so this is kind of a shout out to the psychosomatic thinkers in the group as well. The type of knowledge that we're edging towards here between conscious and unconscious knowledge is a corporal knowledge that is often described as bone deep and often gives us sayings like this: I feel it in my bones. I know it in my heart. I can sense it. I have a gut feeling, and so on. In short, this is a way of knowing that is all about the body. It is all about corporality, that encore with a space between the N and the C that we've been discussing. And notice how this marks a perfect inversion of conscious knowledge. In conscious knowledge, you've got signifieds over signifiers over bodies, you heard me say. In corporal knowledge, that hierarchy is inverted. In corporal knowledge, speaking bodies take priority over the signifiers they emit, and the signifiers they emit take priority over the signifieds. You see? Now you can know which one is more Lacanian. Corporal knowledge is Lacanian knowledge. You think it's about the unconscious. Yeah, maybe to some extent. Lacan at this point is thinking about corporal knowledge. A way of speaking, being, thinking, and knowing in the world, where speaking bodies take priority over the signifiers they emit, and these signifiers take priority over the signifieds that they effect. Effect with an E. here. Now I'm tempted to just keep running with that, but time is short. It's Saturday. It's beautiful in California. I got to get out here and go do some shit, man. I don't know what I'm going to do. I tell you what I'm going to do is I'm just going to roam the streets of San Francisco, trying not to get sunburned. Sunglasses, earbuds, probably listening to the new album by Jerry Paper, the great artist that was so generous as to donate the theme song for our podcast. I love this new album. This album's fire. I got to get to that. And I know you got shit to do too. So let's cut to the chase. I told you that there were 3 types of enjoyment. And each one was connected to a type of knowledge. We now know what the knowledges are. Conscious knowledge, unconscious knowledge, and between them, irreducible to each corporal knowledge. What I'm here to tell you is there's an enjoyment that comes with each field of knowing. And when you see how this lines up, you will then see why this matters to our understanding of Seminar 20. Check it out. With conscious knowledge, mediated through the signifier, just as we've discussed it, with conscious knowledge comes phallic enjoyment. Or, as we've been toying with it, necessary enjoyment. Think even masculine enjoyment here, with the formula that reads all of their enjoyment is governed by the phallic function. Masculine enjoyment is necessarily phallic. How about unconscious knowledge? What type of enjoyment are we talking about there? With unconscious knowledge, beyond even the most symptomatic expression. So remember, we're talking about the part of unconscious knowledge that cannot be known, and thus is unknowable. In other words, even the most symptomatic of expression ain't gonna touch that shit. With unconscious knowledge of the unknowable sort comes other enjoyment, or as we've been saying, impossible enjoyment. Here, think feminine enjoyment beyond the phallic function. That is the type of enjoyment that comes with unknowable, unconscious knowledge. And again, we have a formula for this. If you need a bumper sticker for this one, it's the formula that reads, not all of her enjoyment is governed by the phallic function. It's that not all. So note this. With conscious knowledge comes the all formula of masculine enjoyment. All of their enjoyment is governed by the phallic function. With unconscious knowledge of the unknowable sort, we get Lacan's other bull's head upside down capital A formula. Not an all formula, but a not all formula. The one that says not all of her enjoyment is governed by the phallic function. So conscious knowledge puts us on the path of enjoyment that is wholly governed by the phallic function. Unknowable, unconscious knowledge puts us on the path of an enjoyment that is not entirely governed by the phallic function. Note how that stacks up. It's pretty clean. What about this third? This third that I'm certain we're going to get into it about. What about corporal knowledge? Between conscious and unconscious knowledge, corporal knowledge. What about that strand of knowledge that I told you is rooted in the body? In that affective bodily sensory experience, that encore that I told you Seminar 20 is fundamentally about. And I've been saying it since the start. What kind of enjoyment does this embodied sensory type of knowledge facilitate? I believe it facilitates the kind of enjoyment that consists in testifying to one's experience of unconscious knowledge beyond conscious knowledge and symptomatic statement alike. I believe it facilitates the kind of enjoyment that consists in testifying to one's experience of impossible enjoyment beyond its necessary correlate. I believe it consists in facilitating the kind of enjoyment that shows someone testifying to their experience of feminine enjoyment beyond the phallic function. This is the type of enjoyment that comes with saying you experience but know nothing about enjoyment beyond the phallic function. Yet another reason, perhaps the best reason, to consider those mystics. If mystical experience cannot be said and cannot be known, mystical testimony consists in saying just that. And it might sound something like this. I have experienced a mode of enjoyment that cannot be said and cannot be known, and I'm powerless to say anything more about it. Does this sound familiar? It damn well oughta. Mystical testimony functions much like symptomatic sayings, which always say the same thing. I'm not it. And don't even get me started on love letters. Yesterday, the group got me going on love letters. Man, let me tell you, love letters. Words fail as I attempt to express the depth of my love for you. And if you've been paying attention, you know that all this labor of love that you see in these lectures, in these discussions, these are all just fundamentally love letters of my own, addressed to she who shall not be named. Not yet, at least. I'm not it, we say when the symptom passes our lips. I'm not it, we write when the page begins to drip with love. I'm not it. Note, there are two truths here, I'm telling you. One which lends itself to testimonies like this, which say I'm not it, and one which doesn't. And so the symptom continues. And it's this latter truth, not that of the testimony you're hearing right now, that warrants our attention. Like I said, I'm not it. Now, what we're adding here with these captions, and this is just the start, is an emphasis on enjoyment. I hope you heard it in my voice. I hope you heard it in some of what I was talking about as I edge toward some of the most profound enjoyment of my life. What we're adding here with these captions is an emphasis on the type of enjoyment that comes with testifying to one's experience of an enjoyment that cannot be known, that cannot be said, that does not lend itself to signifying articulation. If mystical experience is impossible enjoyment, akin to feminine enjoyment beyond the phallic function, what kind of enjoyment comes with mystical testimonies to this experience? And does this type of enjoyment have a modality of its own? I'm going to risk jumping the gun here. I haven't read ahead in this seminar. I'm not even sure I'm going to say about the next chapter. I dipped into it for a minute and was like, holy shit. Here we're just on chapter 6. So I'm going to risk jumping the gun a little bit here. Here's what I would say. The jouissance that comes with saying you have experienced something about which you have no conscious knowledge is feminine, but not in excess of the phallic function. What I'm talking about here is the jouissance that comes with testifying to an experience you've had, but about which you have no conscious knowledge. What I'm saying is that this comports with a certain part of feminine enjoyment, and it's the part of feminine enjoyment that appears in the phallic field. It's the part of feminine enjoyment that is well captured with Lacan's other formula for feminine sexuation, the backwards capital E formula. The one that reads, you can't find any feminized subjects whose enjoyment isn't partly governed by the phallic function. So also with the mystics. not all of their enjoyment consists in mystical experience. Some of it also occurs in mystical testimonies of this experience, and these are the two enjoyments of the mystic that comport so well with the two enjoyments we know as feminine. If mystical experience is impossible in the ways that we've been discussing, what then is the modality of mystical testimony to that experience? I would say that it is not impossibility, but instead, and here again, I risk jumping the gun a bit, contingency. Recall what you know at this point about these modalities. Necessary enjoyment has to be and has to fail. It cannot stop being written. Impossible enjoyment, it cannot be and cannot fail. It cannot stop not being written. All review from previous lectures. What about contingent enjoyment, the newbie of the bunch? Contingent enjoyment fits right in between necessary and impossible enjoyment. Contingent enjoyment is, it occurs. You can see it, but it didn't have to be. It didn't have to occur. It didn't have to show up. It is, but it didn't have to be. Contingent enjoyment is that which stops not being written. Modally speaking, and let's just speak modally here because I think Lacan is a lunatic when it comes to working the modes. And I think it's part and parcel of this ongoing effort of his to overcome Aristotle. There was a lot of that in his last seminar. There's less of that here. But he's starting to solidify his thinking around the modes. Modally speaking, and here I'm thinking more like an Aristotelian than a Kantian, than a Lacanian, contingency may be between necessity and impossibility, just like you heard me say. But I think contingency, modally speaking, I think it's made of different stuff. If something is, that means it's actual. That's another modality, right? The actual. Contingent enjoyment is, it occurs. You can see it out there. That makes it actual. And if something may be, but doesn't have to be, what do you describe it as? It's possible. This is what possibility means. Possibility is that which may come to pass, but doesn't have to come to pass. It may rain today, but I don't think it will. Even if it does, the earbuds through which I'll be blazing Jerry Paper's new album are waterproof, sweat-proof, jouissance-proof. Let me be clear, all joking aside, about what I mean by contingency here. I told you it's between necessity and impossibility, but made of different stuff. And the stuff of which it's made, one part actuality, one part possibility. The contingent is what happens when possibility gives way to actuality. Again, like when it rains, or when you attend our next discussion, or when the mystic sitting to you on the bus on your way to the Zoom connection that'll let you tune in opens their mouth to speak. All of that shit happened, but none of it had to. It did rain, but it didn't have to. You were there, but you didn't have to be there. The mystic spoke, but they were not forced to. This is what I mean when I say the contingent is that which can and does stop not writing itself. It's what may show up, but doesn't have to, and does show up, proving that it can. Right as rain, Zoom discussions, and even mystical discourse. Now, if you wanted to illustrate this further, you absolutely could. You might recall the topology of sexuation with which this series began. And I think we could go ahead and do that work. Let's see what happens if we were to imagine how this might unfold. Imagine a circumstance in which the topology we've been working would have modal categories assigned to it. I think we can do this work, and I think we can do it well. In order to do that, though, we got to get the pen tab out. All right, so let's see if we can do some of this work. And to help us, I got a little champagne flute, got a little champagne glass to help us do some of this drawing that I want to do. So first, what I'd suggest is let's begin by recalling that crescent moon of masculine enjoyment. I think we can draw it just as best we can. Super chill. Oh, it's a beautiful blue boy. Okay, you get the idea. The crescent moon of masculine enjoyment. What I would say here is that in addition to Lacan's formula for masculine enjoyment, the one that reads all of their enjoyment is governed by the phallic function, I think you can label this crescent moon with an N for necessity. This is necessary enjoyment. Masculine enjoyment is necessary enjoyment is phallic enjoyment. Which brings us to that encompassing circle. I'll use red here, just for the hell of it. The encompassing circle of phallic enjoyment is super helpful here. This ain't much of a circle, but you get the idea. It doesn't have to be much of a circle. The encompassing circle of phallic enjoyment, which we label accordingly, we could also call this the field of actuality. And here what I'm going to do is put a big A up there. This ain't the big A you think it is, it's the field of actuality. I think it's useful to think about it this way. Phallic enjoyment is the field of actuality as we know it. Now, we come to the feminine, and that is precisely what our attention has been focused on here. Before we show how feminine subjectivity intersects with this, let's just consider it on its own as a thought experiment. Not that it exists like that, but that it'll help us understand what it is that allows phallic enjoyment to contain part but not all of her enjoyment. So before we show how feminine subjectivity intersects with this red circle of actuality, let's just consider it on its own. And here we'll use purple. Okay. Consider this purple circle. This purple circle is that of feminine subjectivity. And what I'm telling you here is that it has two parts to it. And we can draw them like this. There is part of feminine enjoyment that cannot and does not show up. It is impossible, so I label it with an I. But there is part of feminine enjoyment that can show up, that may show up, and I label this as possibility with a P. This is the part of feminine enjoyment that may appear in the phallic function. Here we're talking about the feminine capacity to enter the phallic field. And you know what happens when this ability is realized, when this capacity is actualized. This aspect of feminine subjectivity passes from possibility to actuality, and in so doing, it becomes contingent. So we can back up and now draw this experience as it appears relative to the phallic field, and with it masculine enjoyment. Here our purple circle has passed from the field of potentiality, you might say, and now has intersected with the field of actuality. We can draw it as such, and we can label it as follows. The part of feminine enjoyment that remains beyond the phallic function continues to be labeled with the I of impossibility. So think about this. You've got the N of necessity in the masculine field, wholly encompassed by the phallic function, and the I of impossibility in the feminine field, excluded from the phallic function. This part of her enjoyment that is beyond, that exceeds the phallic function. Necessary and impossible. And between them, I told you, we had the contingent. I'm labeling the part of feminine enjoyment that appears in the phallic field as a contingent enjoyment. So I'm writing that C here. And what you can see now with this diagram is between necessity and impossibility, there is contingency. And I'm drawing it this way so that you can see which aspects of masculine and feminine enjoyment correspond to each. Necessary enjoyment is masculine enjoyment, and feminine enjoyment is one part contingent and one part impossible. I think this is a great way to start understanding what's happening here as Lacan considers the mystics, as he continues to edge toward a fuller understanding. Of course, no fullness could ever occur, but a fuller understanding of what feminine sexuation involves. The key part about this, at least as I see it, at this point in Seminar 20, is the feminine purple circle here in all its multiplicity. This is a multiplicity. Let's see if we can add a few more captions to this as we move forward. I recalled for you Lacan's use of jouissabsence in Seminar 19 to designate the part of feminine enjoyment that exceeds the phallic function. And you might write it right here. Jouissabsence corresponds to that I of impossibility, which designates the part of her enjoyment that exceeds the phallic function. Jouissabsence is how Lacan is messing with this, because relative to the phallic field, this aspect of feminine enjoyment is absent. It's not present, if you want to think of it that way. This is certainly how he was thinking about it in Or Worse. Here, it seems appropriate to recall his correlate notion from the very same discussion in Seminar 19, what he calls jouissappresence. What an awkward construct, but that is indeed what he uses to describe the contingent appearance of feminine enjoyment in the phallic field. It's a kind of presence, and it corresponds precisely to Lacan's formula of feminine enjoyment, the one we use to describe the part of feminine jouissance that intersects with the phallic field, presenting itself in the field of phallic enjoyment, and allowing us to say shit like, look as hard as you want. You cannot and will not find any feminine subject who's not a little or a lot governed by the phallic function. Now, I told you we want to add some captions to this action. I think we could keep this kind of simple at the risk, and there is a risk in doing so. Were we to round out this theory, this fuller understanding of feminine sexuation, we might start it by drawing two columns. And under each column, you could have a different formula. So, under the column to the left, you could have the famous formula that says, look as hard as you want. You cannot find anyone who's not a little or a lot governed by the phallic function. And then to the right of that, you can have the other formula, the one that reads, not all of her enjoyment is governed by the phallic function. And you could treat these as two columns. Slanted though it may be, I think we can do better. So I take this and very delicately, oh gosh, it's not even any better. So much imperfection with this pen tab. It's here for just illustrative purposes and for the beauty, a little splash of color in the midst of all this. You got these two columns. And I think you could start making sense of feminine enjoyment by maintaining these columns for just a second. On the left-hand side, under the formula, the backwards capital EX formula that says you can't find any who's not a little or a lot governed by the phallic function, this is where you would write jouissappresence in the phallic field. This is where you would write contingency in the phallic field. This is where you see that some, but not all, of her enjoyment. This is where you see unconscious truth that can be said and known, even if only by way of symptomatic statements. On this left-hand side, my friends, this is where you see mystical testimony. Mystical testimony is contingent testimony, a contingent saying that occurs in the phallic field, corresponding with that C that you see on the screen. And on the right-hand side, you have all the other things that you know go there. Under the formula that reads, not all of her enjoyment is governed by the phallic function, you see that jouissabsence, that which is absent from the phallic field. Not the sum, but the not all of feminine enjoyment, that shows us not all of her enjoyment occurring in the field of the phallus. Here you see not contingency, but impossibility. Impossibility at the level of unconscious truths that cannot be said and cannot be known. Indeed, we are talking about the unknowable unconscious here. If mystical testimony belongs to the contingent side of feminine enjoyment, mystical experience belongs on the impossible side. Now, we could go on adding to these two columns. Indeed, I'm tempted always to just keep adding as soon as we start putting columns on the board. But I think we could only do so with a certain risk. What matters here, it seems to me, is the form, not the content of this exercise. In other words, the fact that we have two columns, not one. I think that matters more than what we put under each. Yeah, you want to get it right, and yeah, you want to continue, but just zoom out for a second. Notice what we have. Again, a multiplicity. We don't have one column. We have two columns in the feminine field. And again, consider truth. Truth is an easy way for us to start talking about this because it's so familiar at this point. What matters in the development of truth's two sides, the side of truth that can be said and the side that can't, the two sides which are only ever differentially related to each other, what matters is that they are not one. There is not a whole truth here. 1 plus 1 does not equal 1. It equals 2. A 2 which in turn presupposes a 3, and where 3 or more have gathered, you know I'm going to want to count to 4. And you know how we work this mathematically, so I won't continue this. What I'm trying to remind you of is that it's impossible to tell the whole truth. And not just because there's always a part of truth that resists telling, but also, more fundamentally, because the existence of this other part, distinct from the part of truth that can be told, renders anything like the whole truth impossible. There can be no singular, consistent, whole truth if truth always has two sides, one which can be said and one which can't be said. The part that can't be said is impossible, but so also is the prospect of there ever being a whole truth. That's the point here. There is no such thing as a whole truth. By the sheer fact that there are always at least two truths, whose relationality is irreducibly differential. Just as there's no sexual rapport between them two sexes, there's no such thing as a whole truth above and beyond the two truths we've been discussing for a while now. The whole truth, like the sexual rapport, is impossible. And that's why when you swear on that Bible to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, you need the help of God. You need God's assistance to tell the whole truth because the whole truth doesn't fucking exist. It's impossible. There's not just always more to say. But the fact that there's always more to say, and that which you have already said or are in the process of saying, and that these two remain distinct, prevents anything like the whole truth from even being out there, and thus subject to saying. All we can say is that that shit doesn't exist. Same with the sexual rapport. And same with woman, with a capital W, the signifier that Lacan says cannot signify anything, because there ain't nothing to signify. Womanliness is impossible. Hear me now. Not just because feminine enjoyment never fully appears in the phallic field. That's only part of the story here. Womanliness is impossible, yes, because feminine enjoyment never fully appears in the phallic field, but that's only part of the story. Womanliness is impossible. Woman with a capital W is impossible. Also, because the division of feminine enjoyment into parts which do show up in the phallic field and parts which don't prevents anything like a whole, complete, self-consistent feminine enjoyment from occurring anywhere. And that's what you see in that purple circle. It is not a closed circle. It is a set with multiple parts. In and beyond the field of the phallus, where we mark C for contingent enjoyment and I for impossible enjoyment. In and beyond the field of the phallus, whether you mark it with a C or an I, woman with a W is not. Her universal woman, the woman, la femme, like all the others, does not and cannot exist except as barred. And if you want to think about that red line that marks the intersection of feminine enjoyment with the phallic field anew, think of it as a bar. It's a cut. It's a slash. It's a division marking a differential relation between the part of her enjoyment that is governed by the phallic function, but only ever contingently so, and the part of her enjoyment that is beyond the phallic function, and thus relative to it impossible. In and beyond the phallic function, though, notice this, she is not whole. She's not wholly in the field of the impossible and not wholly in the field of the contingent. Woman with a capital W cannot exist except as barred. And if you tempt me to keep going, I would say just like the big other of Lacanian lore, things really start to come together here. The big other of Lacanian lore is like the capital W woman that we're being introduced to here, which is why our boy keeps queuing up the big O other in Seminar 20. When Lacan says the jouissance of the feminized body symbolizes the big O other with a capital O, he's talking about the big barred other, the other rendered incomplete, lacking, and inconsistent by the fact that it has no big other of its own. Now, you've heard me riff on this before. Ever since our series on Seminar 14, it's become very, very clear. In fact, I think at one point I used the image of a bag of dicks to describe this. I'm only reminded of this because I was at this session the other night with a bunch of Lacanians, and somebody approached me, one of the organizers of this group, says, "You know what? I'm so glad I get to finally meet you in person." And I looked behind my shoulder like, who the fuck is this person talking to? I have no idea who they're speaking to. And they said, "You had me at bag of dicks." And I was like, oh, right, the bag of dicks argument. The bag of dicks argument that puts us on the trail to God. The bag of dicks argument that helps us remember why the other is always barred. If you think about this, the other is always barred. The big O other doesn't exist. Why? Because it doesn't have an other of its own. There is no big other of the big other. If there were, the big other wouldn't be the big other. This is a simple logical argument that Lacan is making here. And it's also, if you recall our series on Seminar 16, why God struggles. The problem with God, the struggle of the divine, is that God doesn't go to church. And the reason why God doesn't go to church is because God's got no one to worship. Just like the big other lacks a big other, God lacks a God. That's why he's so shitty. Bro needs to go to church. But he can't, because he ain't got nobody to worship. What God and the big other both lack, if you follow my thinking here, are relations to God and the big other, like those the rest of us poor saps have trouble escaping. The jouissance of the feminized body that appears in the field of phallic enjoyment is a signifier of all this. It is a living, embodied, corporal reminder that oneness doesn't exist for self, society, and even the divine. Oneself, the big other, your God, all are fantasy figurations of wholeness and nothing more, according to Lacan. 3 among many functions of the phallus. And notice this. We long for oneness with the self. When we can't find oneness with the self, we try to constitute it with others. The most expansive version of that would be known as society, perhaps the nation state, perhaps the global state, if you will. And beyond that, we have the image of God, also as a fantasy figuration of oneness. But Lacan's point is that each of these figurations of oneness only ever exists in a state of lack, with a slash through it, accordingly. So when Lacan ends Chapter 6 of Seminar 20 by telling us to interpret God's face as that of the other, and the latter as based on feminine enjoyment, this is what I think he means. What appears of the other sex, recall where this lecture started, is what appears of the lacking other. Barred woman, with a capital W, is a signifier of the barred other, with a capital O. And the bodies inscribed with this enigmatic signifier, the signifier which marks them as not whole wherever they go. Don't forget that. Wherever the feminine body shows up, it is not whole. It is not whole in the phallic field, and it is not whole beyond the phallic field. The bodies inscribed with the enigmatic signifier of the barred other. This is what Lacan is up to. This signifier which marks them as not whole wherever they go. These are the bodies we've been discussing in discussing the mystics. These are the bodies which say and which enjoy saying that they have enjoyed beyond the phallic function, but have no way of capturing this ecstatic experience in conscious knowledge as mediated through language. It cannot be said, and for this reason it cannot be known either, except in their bones, which brings us to that corporal field of knowledge. This ecstatic, mystical experience beyond the field of conscious knowledge, beyond the field of the phallus, beyond the symbolic, it cannot be said because it's impossible. And as such, it can't be known either, except in a corporal, affective, sensory way, which is why I emphasize in their bones is where they know this, and it's from those bones that they speak, between those eating bones that are the teeth. That is where the enjoyment of saying occurs. And that's about all they can say about it. I can't speak it further. I can't know it either, but I feel it in my bones. Éprouvé. And that's all I can say about it. I feel it in my heart. I feel it in my gut. I feel it in my bones, encore with a space between the N and the C. There's more to enjoy for masculine and feminine subjects alike beyond the phallic function.